Working at fast food restaurants can be a nightmare, but sometimes the horror goes way beyond dealing with difficult customers or broken ice cream machines. What I'm about to share with you are real stories from real people who experience things that still keep them awake at night. These aren't urban legends or creepypastas. These are actual events that happen to ordinary workers just trying to make a living. Before we dive into these terrifying tales, let me tell you why these stories matter. Every single day, millions of people work in fast food establishments across the country. They're often alone during late-night shifts, working in dimly lit buildings with multiple entrances and exits. They handle cash, which makes them targets, and they're usually young, inexperienced, and vulnerable. It's the perfect storm for something sinister to happen. I've spent weeks collecting these stories, verifying details, and speaking with former employees who lived through experiences that changed them forever. What you're about to hear will make you think twice about that late-night drive-through run. It'll make you look at that cheerful teenager behind the counter with a new sense of respect for what they might have endured. The first story comes from Sarah, who worked at a popular burger chain in rural Montana during the summer of 2019. She was 19 at the time, saving money for college by working the closing shift 3 nights a week. The restaurant sat on a lonely stretch of highway, surrounded by nothing but wheat fields and darkness. Most nights, she'd be completely alone for the last 2 hours before closing. It started with small things. Items would be moved around after she'd cleaned and organized them. The walk-in freezer door would swing open on its own, even though she'd made sure it was properly latched. The fryer would make strange clicking sounds when it was turned off. Sarah chalked it up to old equipment and her imagination running wild during those isolated hours. But then the phone calls began, always around 11:30, just as she was starting her closing routine. The voice on the other end was barely a whisper, so quiet she could barely make out what they were saying. At first, she thought it was a prank call from local teenagers. She'd hang up and get back to work, but the calls kept coming, night after night, always at the same time. The voice grew clearer over the weeks. It was definitely a man, and he knew things about her. He knew what she was wearing. He knew she was alone. He knew she drove a red Honda Civic. He knew she lived on Maple Street with her grandmother. Details that made Sarah's skin crawl and her hands shake as she tried to finish cleaning. Sarah started varying her routine, hoping to throw off whoever was watching her. She'd park in different spots, change her clothes in the bathroom, take different routes home. Nothing worked. The caller always knew exactly what she was doing, as if he was right there with her. The breaking point came on a Thursday night in August. Sarah was mopping the dining area when she heard the familiar ring of the phone. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. This time, the voice was different, clearer, more confident. "I can see you right now," he said. "You look tired tonight." Sarah's blood turned to ice. She slowly turned toward the windows, scanning the parking lot. It was empty, except for her car. The highway beyond was dark and silent, but somewhere out there, someone was watching her every move. She grabbed her keys and ran, left everything exactly where it was, the lights on, the doors unlocked, the register open. She didn't stop running until she reached her car, and she didn't stop driving until she was safely inside her grandmother's house. The next morning, Sarah's manager called. The restaurant had been found with all the lights on and the doors wide open. Nothing was stolen, but there were muddy footprints tracked all through the dining area. Footprints that led from the back door to the front counter, then to the window where Sarah had been standing when she got that final call. Sarah quit that day. She never went back, not even to pick up her final paycheck. But the story doesn't end there. 3 weeks later, a new girl started working the closing shift. Her name was Jessica, and she was 18, fresh out of high school, excited about her first job. Jessica lasted exactly 4 nights. On her 5th shift, she called the police at 11:45, sobbing into the phone that someone was trying to break into the restaurant. When officers arrived, they found her huddled in the walk-in freezer, shaking uncontrollably. She kept repeating that someone had been tapping on the windows, circling the building, trying every door. The police found fresh footprints in the mud around the building, size 11 work boots, the same boots that had left prints inside the restaurant the night Sarah ran. But they never found the person who made them. That restaurant closed permanently 6 months later. The official reason was declining profits, but everyone in town knew the real story. No one wanted to work there anymore, and customers started avoiding the place after word spread about the incidents. Our second story takes place in a completely different setting, but it's just as disturbing. Marcus worked at a fried chicken restaurant in downtown Detroit. This wasn't some isolated highway location. This was a busy urban area with plenty of foot traffic and other businesses nearby. Marcus felt safe there, especially compared to some of the other places he'd worked. Marcus had been with the company for 2 years when they promoted him to assistant manager. Part of his new responsibilities included opening the store at 5 in the morning, long before any other employees arrived. He'd unlock the doors, turn on the equipment, and start the prep work for the day. The building was old, built in the 1960s, with a basement that served as storage for supplies and equipment. Marcus had always felt uneasy about going down there alone, but he'd never been able to put his finger on why. Maybe it was the single flickering fluorescent light that never seemed to stay steady. Maybe it was the way sound echoed off the concrete walls. Or maybe it was the small door at the far end of the basement that was always kept locked. Marcus had asked about that door during his first week on the job. His manager told him it led to an old tunnel system that connected several buildings in the area, left over from the days when the basement was used for completely different purposes. The door stayed locked for safety reasons, and Marcus was told to never worry about it. But Marcus started noticing things. The door would sometimes be slightly ajar when he went down to get supplies, even though he was certain it had been closed tight the day before. He'd push it shut and make sure it latched properly, but the next morning it would be open again. Just a crack, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. Then Marcus started hearing sounds coming from behind that door, scratching noises like fingernails on concrete, soft thumping sounds that seemed to move from one side to the other, sometimes what sounded like whispered conversations, too muffled to make out words, but clearly human voices. The sounds only happened in the early morning hours, before the other employees arrived. Marcus began to dread those first few hours alone in the building. He'd rush through his opening duties, trying to avoid the basement altogether. But eventually, he'd have to go down there to get supplies, and every time he did, those sounds would start up again. The fluorescent lights of a fast food restaurant at 2 a.m. cast everything in an unsettling glow. The smell of grease hangs heavy in the air, mixing with disinfectant and something else you can't quite place. You're hungry, tired, and just want something quick before heading home. The teenager behind the counter forces a smile as they hand you your order, steam rising from the paper bag. You trust that what's inside is safe, prepared by people who care about your well-being. But sometimes, that trust is shattered in the most horrifying ways imaginable. Tonight, I'm sharing 4 true fast food horror stories that will make you think twice before pulling into that drive-thru. These aren't urban legends or creepypasta tales shared around campfires. These are real incidents that happen to real people, documented by news outlets and health departments. Stories that reveal the dark side of an industry that serves millions of customers every single day. From contaminated food that sent dozens to the hospital, to discoveries so revolting they'll haunt your dreams. These stories expose what can go wrong when quality control fails and human error turns deadly. Each incident I'm about to share represents a complete breakdown of the systems designed to keep us safe. Moments when the convenience we rely on became a nightmare. The first story takes us to a McDonald's in suburban Denver, where a routine lunch order became a fight for survival. Sarah Martinez was a 34-year-old marketing executive who worked long hours and relied on fast food for most of her meals. She was known for her punctuality, her attention to detail, and her habit of always ordering the same thing wherever she went. At McDonald's, it was always a quarter pounder with cheese, no pickles, extra onions, and a large Coke. October 15th, 2024. Started like any other Tuesday for Sarah. She had back-to-back meetings scheduled through lunch, so she decided to grab something quick from the McDonald's across from her office building. The restaurant was busy, filled with the usual lunch crowd of office workers and construction crews. She placed her order at the counter, waited the standard 5 minutes, and carried her tray to a corner booth where she could eat while reviewing client presentations on her laptop. The first few bites tasted normal, the familiar flavors of processed beef, melted cheese, and that distinctive McDonald's sauce. But by the fourth bite, something felt off. The meat had a strange metallic taste that she couldn't quite identify. She assumed it was just her imagination, maybe stress from the morning's meetings affecting her taste buds. She took another bite, then another, finishing about half the burger before returning to her office. Within 2 hours, Sarah began experiencing severe stomach cramps. At first, she attributed it to eating too quickly, but the pain intensified rapidly. By 4 p.m., she was doubled over at her desk, sweating and nauseous. Her co-workers insisted she go home, but Sarah barely made it to her car before violent diarrhea struck. She spent the rest of the evening alternating between her bed and the bathroom, convinced she had food poisoning, but expecting it to pass by morning. It didn't pass. By Wednesday, Sarah was running a high fever and couldn't keep any food down. The diarrhea had become bloody, and she was becoming dangerously dehydrated. Her roommate found her unconscious on the bathroom floor Thursday morning and called 911. At the hospital, doctors immediately recognized the symptoms. Sarah had contracted E. coli 0157H7, a particularly dangerous strain of the bacteria that can cause kidney failure and death. As Sarah fought for her life in the ICU, health department investigators traced the contamination back to that McDonald's location. They discovered that the restaurant had received a shipment of slivered onions from a supplier in California that had been contaminated with E. coli. The same onions that Sarah had specifically requested extra of were the source of the bacteria now attacking her kidneys. The investigation revealed a horrifying scope of contamination. Over the next week, 23 more people from the Denver area were hospitalized with E. coli infections, all linked to quarter pounders from the same McDonald's location. The ages ranged from 8 to 87 years old. 2 victims developed hemolytic uremic syndrome, a life-threatening condition that causes kidney failure. An elderly man named Robert Chen didn't survive. Sarah spent 3 weeks in the hospital, her kidneys barely functioning as doctors fought to save her life. The medical bills exceeded $200,000, and she was unable to work for 2 months. Even after returning to her job, she suffered from chronic digestive issues and anxiety attacks whenever she smelled fast food cooking. The simple act of eating lunch had become a source of terror. The contaminated onions came from a processing facility in California that supplied multiple McDonald's locations across 14 states. The facility had passed its most recent inspection just 2 months before the outbreak, but investigators later discovered that the E. coli contamination likely occurred in the fields where the onions were grown, possibly from contaminated irrigation water or contact with infected livestock. McDonald's immediately pulled quarter pounders from thousands of locations and switched to a new onion supplier, but the damage was done. The company faced dozens of lawsuits from victims and their families, and their stock price dropped significantly in the weeks following the outbreak. For Sarah and the other survivors, no amount of money could erase the trauma of nearly dying from a routine lunch order. The second story takes us to a Taco Bell in Phoenix, Arizona, where a young couple's date night turned into a scene from a horror movie. Marcus Thompson, 22, and his girlfriend Lisa Chen, 21, were college students at Arizona State University. They had been dating for 6 months and made it a tradition to visit the Taco Bell near campus every Friday night after Marcus finished his shift at the campus bookstore. It was a warm evening in September when they walked into the familiar restaurant, the smell of seasoned beef and cheese welcoming them like an old friend. Marcus ordered his usual Crunch Wrap Supreme with extra cheese, while Lisa opted for a chicken quesadilla and nachos to share. They found a booth near the window and settled in for what they thought would be another relaxing end to their week. Marcus was halfway through his Crunch Wrap when he felt something hard crunch between his teeth. At first, he thought it was just a piece of the hard shell, but the texture was wrong. It was too thick, too brittle. He spit the contents of his mouth onto his napkin and immediately felt his stomach lurch. Mixed in with the lettuce and cheese was what appeared to be a piece of glass, about the size of a dime, with sharp edges that had cut the inside of his mouth. Lisa screamed when she saw the blood on Marcus's napkin and the glass fragment glinting under the restaurant's fluorescent lights. Other customers turned to stare as Marcus ran to the bathroom, spitting blood into the sink. His mouth was filling with blood faster than he could rinse it out, and he could feel cuts on his tongue and the inside of his cheek where the glass had sliced through soft tissue. The manager, a tired-looking woman in her 40s named Patricia, came over to their table as Lisa frantically gathered the glass pieces with a napkin. Patricia's first response was to offer them a free meal, as if that would somehow make up for the fact that Marcus was bleeding from multiple lacerations in his mouth. When Lisa demanded to know how glass got into the food, Patricia claimed it must have been an accident, maybe a broken light bulb or something falling from the ceiling. But the investigation that followed revealed something far more sinister. The glass hadn't fallen from anywhere. It had been deliberately placed in the food by a disgruntled employee who had been planning to quit that day. Security footage showed 19-year-old Kevin Rodriguez, who had been working at the restaurant for only 3 weeks, crushing a glass bottle in the prep area and mixing the fragments into the ground beef used for the Crunch Wrap Supremes. Rodriguez had been reprimanded earlier that day for showing up late to his shift, and his supervisor had threatened to write him up if it happened again. In his twisted mind, contaminating the food was his way of getting back at the management, though he later claimed he never intended to hurt anyone seriously. He had planned to quit after his shift and figured the contamination would be discovered before anyone actually ate the food. Marcus required emergency surgery to remove glass fragments from his mouth and throat. Several pieces had embedded themselves so deeply in his tongue that they required careful extraction under anesthesia. He couldn't eat solid food for 2 weeks and had to communicate through written notes because speaking was too painful. The cuts in his mouth became infected, requiring a course of antibiotics that made him violently ill. Lisa, meanwhile, discovered that she had also consumed glass fragments. While examining her nachos after Marcus's discovery, she found several smaller pieces mixed in with the cheese. She had been chewing carefully after seeing what happened to Marcus, so her injuries were less severe, but she still required medical attention for cuts on her gums and the roof of her mouth. The psychological trauma was perhaps worse than the physical injuries. Both Marcus and Lisa developed severe anxiety around eating, especially at restaurants. Lisa lost 15 pounds in the month following the incident because she couldn't bring herself to eat anything she hadn't prepared herself. Marcus had nightmares about choking on glass and would wake up in a cold sweat, feeling phantom pain in his mouth. Rodriguez was arrested and charged with food tampering, reckless endangerment, and assault. During his interrogation, he broke down and confessed to the deliberate contamination, claiming he was sorry and that he never meant for anyone to get hurt. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution for the victim's medical expenses. The Taco Bell location was temporarily shut down for investigation and deep cleaning. Health inspectors discovered that the restaurant had violated several safety protocols, including inadequate supervision of employees and failure to properly secure glass containers in the prep area. The franchise owner faced significant fines and was required to implement new safety measures, including security cameras in all food preparation areas. For Marcus and Lisa, the settlement money from their lawsuit couldn't restore their sense of safety around food. They broke up 6 months later, unable to cope with the shared trauma and the way it had changed their relationship. Marcus changed his major from business to criminal justice, saying the experience had shown him how easily someone could hurt innocent people. Lisa transferred to a different school, unable to handle the memories associated with their old campus and the Taco Bell, where their lives had been forever altered. The third story comes from a Burger King in Miami, Florida, where a routine breakfast order became a mother's worst nightmare. Jennifer Rodriguez was a 28-year-old single mother who worked as a nurse at Miami General Hospital. She had just finished a grueling 12-hour night shift and was exhausted as she picked up her 6-year-old daughter Emma from her babysitter's house. Emma had been begging for pancakes all week, and Jennifer had promised they would get breakfast together before heading home to sleep. It was 7:30 a.m. on a Saturday morning when they pulled into the Burger King drive-thru, the restaurant bustling with the weekend breakfast crowd. Jennifer ordered Emma's favorite, pancakes with syrup and a chocolate milk, along with a coffee for herself to help her stay awake long enough to get Emma settled at home. The drive-thru employee, a teenager who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, handed them their order with barely a glance. Jennifer paid and drove to a nearby park where Emma liked to eat while watching the ducks in the pond. It was their special tradition after Jennifer's night shifts, a quiet moment together before the chaos of the day began. Emma was excited as she opened the styrofoam container, her eyes lighting up at the sight of the golden pancakes. She poured the syrup herself, proud of her growing independence, and took a big bite. Jennifer was sipping her coffee and checking her phone when she heard Emma make a strange gagging sound. She looked up to see her daughter's face contorting in disgust, her small hand covering her mouth. "Mommy, it tastes funny," Emma whispered, her voice muffled by her hand. Jennifer looked at the pancakes and noticed something dark mixed in with the batter. At first, she thought it might be chocolate chips, but as she looked closer, her blood ran cold. The dark spots were moving. They were flies, dozens of them, baked right into the pancakes. Jennifer's medical training kicked in immediately. She made Emma spit out everything in her mouth and rinse with water from their emergency bottle. Emma was crying now, not understanding what was happening, but sensing her mother's panic. Jennifer could see at least 20 flies embedded in the pancakes, their bodies clearly visible against the golden batter. Some were whole, others were in pieces, creating a horrifying mosaic of insect parts mixed with what should have been a child's breakfast. The drive back to the Burger King was a blur of anger and terror. Jennifer stormed into the restaurant, carrying the container of contaminated pancakes, with Emma clinging to her leg. The manager, a middle-aged man named Carlos, looked genuinely shocked when he saw the evidence. He immediately called the health department and offered to pay for any medical expenses, but Jennifer was already on the phone with 911. The health department investigation revealed a restaurant in complete violation of basic sanitation standards. The pancake batter had been left uncovered overnight, allowing flies to land in it and get trapped when the batter was mixed the next morning. The fly infestation in the kitchen was so severe that inspectors found dead insects in multiple food preparation areas, including the grill, the fryer, and the refrigerated storage units. The restaurant had been operating with a broken screen door in the kitchen area for over a month, allowing flies to enter freely. The exhaust system was clogged with grease, creating breeding grounds for insects. Most disturbing of all, this wasn't the first time flies had been found in the food. 3 other customers had complained about insects in their orders over the past 2 weeks, but the manager had dismissed their concerns as isolated incidents. Emma was rushed to the emergency room where Jennifer worked, adding another layer of humiliation to the ordeal. Her colleagues were shocked to see her daughter as a patient, and Jennifer had to explain repeatedly how flies had ended up in her child's breakfast. Emma was treated for potential bacterial infections and given medications to prevent illness from the contaminated food. The psychological impact on Emma was severe. She developed a phobia of insects that persisted for years, and eating became a source of anxiety. She would inspect every bite of food, sometimes using a magnifying glass Jennifer had bought to help her feel safe. The simple joy of sharing a meal had been replaced by hypervigilance and fear. The Burger King was closed for 2 weeks, while the entire kitchen was deep cleaned and the fly infestation was eliminated. The franchise owner was fined $50,000 and required to implement a comprehensive pest control program. 3 employees, including the manager, were fired for their negligence in maintaining sanitary conditions. Jennifer sued the restaurant for damages, not just for the medical expenses, but for the trauma inflicted on her daughter. The settlement included money for Emma's therapy, which she needed to overcome her fear of eating and her nightmares about insects. The case made local news, and Jennifer received dozens of messages from other parents sharing similar experiences at fast food restaurants. Years later, Emma still struggles with anxiety around food, especially breakfast items. She's now 12 and has learned to cope with her phobia, but she still checks every bite of food before eating it. Jennifer changed jobs shortly after the incident, unable to handle the stress of working in emergency medicine while dealing with her daughter's trauma. The breakfast tradition they once shared never resumed, and Emma now prefers to eat at home, where she feels safe. The fourth and final story takes us to a KFC in Detroit, Michigan, where a family dinner became a scene of absolute horror. David Washington, a 45-year-old auto worker, had just received his paycheck and decided to treat his family to their favorite meal. He lived with his wife Patricia, 42, and their 3 children, 16-year-old Michael, 12-year-old Angela, and 8-year-old Tyrone. It was a Friday evening in March, and David wanted to celebrate making it through another tough week at the plant. The family had been struggling financially, and fast food dinners were rare treats they all looked forward to. David called ahead to place a large order, a family bucket of original recipe chicken, mashed potatoes, coleslaw, and biscuits for everyone. When David arrived at the KFC, the restaurant was busy with the dinner rush. He waited in line for 15 minutes, watching the staff hurry around behind the counter, filling orders and restocking the warming trays. The smell of fried chicken filled the air, making his mouth water as he thought about his family's excitement when he walked through the door with their feast. The teenage cashier, who looked overwhelmed by the crowd, handed David his order in 2 large bags. David paid the $35, a significant expense for his family's tight budget, and drove home with the windows down, the aroma of the chicken making the short drive feel longer than usual. Patricia had set the table with their good plates, the ones they only used for special occasions, and the children were already seated and waiting. The family dug in eagerly, everyone talking at once about their day as they pulled pieces of chicken from the bucket. David had just bitten into a drumstick when he felt something unusual. The meat was stringy, tougher than normal, and had a strange grayish color that didn't look quite right. He was about to mention it when 12-year-old Angela suddenly screamed. She was staring at the chicken breast in her hands, her face pale with shock. Protruding from one end of the piece was a long, thin, pink appendage that definitely wasn't part of a chicken. It was a tail. A rat's tail, complete with fur and the distinctive scaly texture that made it unmistakably identifiable. The entire family froze, staring at the horrifying sight as the reality sank in. Angela had been eating what she thought was chicken, but it was actually a rat that had somehow made its way into the fryer and been cooked along with the chicken. The grayish color David had noticed wasn't seasoning or unusual preparation. It was the color of cooked rat meat. The strange texture wasn't tough chicken. It was rodent muscle that had been deep fried and served to his family as food. Patricia immediately made all the children spit out whatever they had in their mouths and rinse with water. Angela was hysterical, gagging and crying as she realized what she had been eating. Michael, the oldest, ran to the bathroom and vomited violently. 8-year-old Tyrone didn't fully understand what was happening, but began crying because everyone else was upset. David's hands shook as he called 911, his voice barely controlled as he explained the situation to the dispatcher. The family was rushed to the hospital, where doctors pumped their stomachs and began treatment for potential diseases that could be transmitted from rodents to humans. They were tested for Salmonella, E. coli, and numerous other pathogens that rats commonly carry. The health department investigation revealed conditions at the KFC that were beyond belief. The restaurant had a massive rat infestation that had been ongoing for months. Rats were living in the walls, the storage areas, and even the spaces around the fryers. The infestation was so severe that rat droppings were found throughout the kitchen, and there were clear signs that rodents had been accessing the food preparation areas regularly. The investigation determined that a rat had likely fallen into the fryer while the oil was heating up, becoming trapped and cooked along with the chicken. The staff either didn't notice or chose to ignore the contamination, allowing the rat to be breaded, seasoned, and served to the Washington family as if it were chicken. The restaurant was immediately shut down by health officials, and the entire staff was questioned about their knowledge of the infestation. Several employees admitted they had seen rats in the kitchen, but were told by management to ignore them and continue working. The manager claimed he was unaware of the extent of the problem, but evidence suggested the infestation had been reported multiple times without proper action being taken. The Washington family suffered severe psychological trauma from the incident. Angela developed an eating disorder, unable to consume meat without having panic attacks. She lost 20 pounds over the following months and required extensive therapy to address her food-related anxiety. Michael became obsessed with food safety, researching restaurant violations and refusing to eat at any establishment that had received poor health grades. David sued KFC for damages, and the case became a national news story. The settlement was substantial, but no amount of money could undo the trauma his family had experienced. The restaurant remained closed for 6 months, while the building was completely renovated and the rat infestation was eliminated. When it finally reopened, it was under new management, with entirely new staff. The incident had lasting effects on the entire family. Patricia developed severe anxiety and depression, unable to cook or eat without thinking about the contaminated food. Tyrone, the youngest, didn't understand why his family had changed so much, and he began having behavioral problems at school. David took time off work to help his family cope, putting additional financial strain on an already struggling household. These 4 stories represent just a fraction of the food safety failures that occur in fast food restaurants every day. Each incident reveals how quickly a routine meal can become a life-threatening situation, and how the systems designed to protect consumers can fail in the most devastating ways. The victims in these stories were ordinary people who trusted that their food was safe, only to discover that trust was misplaced. The fast food industry serves over 50 million Americans every single day, processing billions of pounds of meat, vegetables, and other ingredients through complex supply chains that stretch across the globe. When these systems work properly, they deliver hot, affordable meals to hungry customers in minutes. But when they fail, the consequences can be catastrophic. What makes these stories particularly terrifying is their randomness. The victims weren't doing anything wrong or taking unnecessary risks. They were simply hungry people who made the same choice millions of others make every day. Sarah could have been anyone. Marcus and Lisa were just college students on a date. Jennifer was a hard-working mother trying to treat her daughter. David was celebrating payday with his family. Any of us could have been in their position, ordering the same meals from the same restaurants, with no way of knowing what horrors awaited us. The McDonald's E. coli outbreak that nearly killed Sarah wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern of food safety failures that have plagued the industry for decades. The contaminated onions came from a supplier that had passed recent inspections, highlighting how easily dangerous pathogens can slip through the cracks of our food safety system. The fact that 23 other people were hospitalized and 1 person died shows how quickly a single point of contamination can spread, turning a routine lunch into a public health crisis. Kevin Rodriguez's deliberate contamination of the Taco Bell food reveals another terrifying reality about fast food safety. The teenager who crushed glass into Marcus and Lisa's meal wasn't a hardened criminal or someone with a history of violence. He was just an angry kid who made a split-second decision that destroyed multiple lives. The ease with which he was able to tamper with the food shows how vulnerable we are to the actions of disturbed individuals who have access to our meals. The fly-infested pancakes that traumatized Emma at Burger King weren't the result of a single mistake or bad day. They were the product of systematic neglect and violation of basic sanitation standards. The restaurant had been operating with broken screens, clogged exhaust systems, and uncovered food for weeks. Multiple customers had complained about insects in their food, but management had dismissed their concerns. Emma's breakfast was contaminated because the people responsible for keeping the food safe had failed at every level. The rat that was deep-fried and served to the Washington family at KFC represents perhaps the most horrifying failure of all. This wasn't accidental contamination or deliberate sabotage by an individual employee. It was the result of a massive infestation that had been allowed to persist for months. The staff had seen rats in the kitchen, but continued working anyway. Management had been informed, but took no action. The rat that ended up in the fryer was just one of many that had been living in the restaurant's walls and food preparation areas. These stories share common elements that make them particularly disturbing. In each case, the victims trusted that basic safety protocols were being followed. They assumed that the food they were eating had been prepared in clean conditions by people who cared about their well-being. They believed that government inspections and corporate quality control measures would protect them from harm. That trust was betrayed in the most fundamental way possible. The psychological impact on the victims extends far beyond the immediate physical harm. Sarah Martinez still suffers from anxiety attacks when she smells fast food cooking. Marcus Thompson changed his entire career path because of what happened to him. Emma Rodriguez developed a phobia of insects that required years of therapy to overcome. The Washington family was torn apart by trauma that affected each member differently, but devastated them all. These incidents also reveal the broader systemic problems in the fast food industry. The pressure to serve food quickly and cheaply creates conditions where safety can be compromised. Employees are often young, inexperienced, and poorly trained. Turnover rates are high, making it difficult to maintain consistent standards. Equipment failures, supply chain contamination, and human error are inevitable in any large-scale food operation, but the consequences can be catastrophic when they occur. The financial impact on the restaurants involved was significant but temporary. McDonald's stock price recovered within months of the E. coli outbreak. The Taco Bell location reopened under new management after paying fines and implementing new safety measures. The Burger King was deep cleaned and resumed operations with better pest control. The KFC was renovated and restaffed. For these corporate entities, the incidents were costly but survivable business disruptions. For the victims, however, the impact was permanent and life-altering. Sarah's medical bills exceeded $200,000, and she lost months of income while recovering from kidney damage. Marcus required surgery to remove glass from his mouth and throat, leaving him with permanent scarring. Emma's therapy costs continued for years as she struggled to overcome her food-related anxiety. The Washington family's psychological trauma affected their relationships, their ability to work, and their children's development. The legal settlements in these cases, while substantial, couldn't truly compensate for what the victims had lost. Money can pay for medical treatment and therapy, but it can't restore the simple pleasure of eating a meal without fear. It can't give back the trust that was destroyed or repair the relationships that were damaged by shared trauma. These stories also highlight the reactive nature of food safety enforcement. In each case, serious violations and dangerous conditions existed before the incidents occurred, but they weren't discovered until after people were seriously harmed. The McDonald's supplier had passed recent inspections, despite the contamination that nearly killed Sarah. The Taco Bell employee was able to access glass containers and food preparation areas without adequate supervision. The Burger King had been operating with broken screens and fly infestations for weeks before Emma's contaminated breakfast. The KFC's rat infestation had been ongoing for months before the Washington family's horrific meal. The investigations that followed each incident revealed systemic failures at multiple levels. Suppliers failed to maintain sanitary conditions. Restaurant management ignored safety protocols. Employees were inadequately trained or supervised. Government inspectors missed obvious violations. Corporate quality control systems failed to detect problems before they reached consumers. Each link in the chain had opportunities to prevent these tragedies, but the failures compounded until disaster was inevitable. The media coverage of these incidents was intense, but brief. Sarah's E. coli case made national news for a few days before being overshadowed by other stories. Marcus and Lisa's glass contamination was covered by local outlets, but quickly forgotten. Emma's fly-infested breakfast generated outrage on social media that faded within a week. The Washington family's rat incident became a viral news story that sparked jokes and memes before disappearing from public consciousness. But for the victims, the story never ended. Years later, they're still dealing with the consequences of those horrific meals. Sarah takes medication for chronic digestive issues and sees a therapist for anxiety. Marcus changed careers and struggles with trust issues in relationships. Emma, now a teenager, still inspects her food carefully and avoids certain restaurants. The Washington children have all been affected in different ways by the trauma they experienced as a family. These incidents represent a small fraction of the food safety failures that occur in fast food restaurants every day. Most contamination events don't result in serious illness or make headlines. Most foreign objects in food are discovered before they cause injury. Most employee misconduct is caught before it reaches customers. But the potential for catastrophic failure exists in every transaction, every meal, every bite. The victims in these stories were chosen at random by circumstances beyond their control. They were in the wrong place at the wrong time, ordering the wrong food from the wrong restaurant on the wrong day. There was nothing they could have done to prevent what happened to them. No amount of caution or research could have protected them from contaminated onions, deliberate sabotage, insect infestations, or rodent contamination. The randomness of these incidents is what makes them so terrifying. We can't predict when or where the next food safety failure will occur. We can't know which restaurant will have the next outbreak, which employee will make the next fatal mistake, which supplier will allow the next contamination. We can only hope that the systems designed to protect us will work, and trust that the people handling our food care about our safety as much as we do. The next time you pull into a fast food drive-thru or walk up to a counter to place your order, remember these stories. Remember Sarah fighting for her life in the ICU. Remember Marcus spitting blood after biting into glass. Remember Emma's terror at finding flies in her pancakes. Remember the Washington family's horror at discovering they had been eating rat meat. These stories aren't meant to scare you away from fast food entirely, but to remind you that the convenience we take for granted comes with risks we rarely consider. Every meal is an act of trust, and sometimes that trust is betrayed in the most horrifying ways imaginable. The victims in these stories trusted that their food was safe, and that trust nearly killed them. The fast food industry has made improvements since these incidents occurred, but the fundamental risks remain. As long as food is prepared by humans in high-pressure environments and distributed through complex supply chains, there will be opportunities for contamination, sabotage, and negligence. The only question is who will be the next victim, and whether they'll be lucky enough to survive their encounter with the dark side of fast food. So the next time you're sitting in your car at a drive-thru, engine idling as you wait for your order, take a moment to look around. Notice the teenagers behind the counter rushing to fill orders during the dinner rush. Watch the steam rising from the fryers and the hurried movements of workers trying to keep up with demand. Think about the complex supply chains that brought that food to your tray, the multiple hands that touched it before it reached you, and the systems designed to keep you safe. Remember that every meal is an act of faith. Faith that the person preparing your food cares about your well-being. Faith that the suppliers and distributors maintained proper safety standards. Faith that the government inspectors caught any violations before they could harm you. Faith that corporate quality control measures actually work when it matters most. But sometimes that faith is misplaced. Sometimes the systems fail. Sometimes the people we trust to keep us safe make mistakes or simply don't care. Sometimes a routine meal becomes a nightmare that haunts victims for years afterward. The stories I've shared tonight represent just a fraction of the food safety failures that occur every single day across the country. Sarah Martinez still takes medication for the kidney damage caused by contaminated onions. She'll never fully recover from the E. coli infection that nearly killed her. Marcus Thompson bears permanent scars in his mouth from the glass that was deliberately mixed into his food. Emma Rodriguez, now a teenager, still struggles with eating anxiety that began when she was just 6 years old. The Washington family was torn apart by trauma that affected each member differently, but devastated them all. These weren't random acts of violence or deliberate attacks on innocent people. They were the predictable result of a system that prioritizes speed and profit over safety. A system where young, inexperienced employees work in high-pressure environments with minimal training, where suppliers cut corners to reduce costs, where managers ignore safety violations to keep operations running smoothly, where government inspectors are overwhelmed and understaffed. The corporate responses to these incidents followed a predictable pattern. Lawyers were hired, settlements were negotiated, public relations firms crafted statements expressing concern and promising improvements. New safety protocols were implemented, staff was retrained, equipment was upgraded, and then, once the media attention faded and the lawsuits were settled, many of these improvements were quietly abandoned. The cycle repeats itself with depressing regularity. Outbreak occurs. Investigation reveals systemic failures. Promises are made. Changes are implemented. Public attention moves on. Standards slip. Another outbreak occurs. The victims become statistics in reports that few people read. Their suffering reduced to data points in corporate risk assessments. But the real horror isn't just in the individual incidents I've described tonight. It's in the knowledge that these failures will continue to occur. That somewhere, right now, contaminated food is being prepared in restaurants across the country. That employees are making decisions that will harm innocent customers. That supply chains are failing in ways that won't be discovered until people start getting sick. The randomness of these incidents makes them particularly terrifying. You can't protect yourself by avoiding certain restaurants or certain types of food. The McDonald's that nearly killed Sarah had passed recent health inspections. The Taco Bell where Marcus was injured had no history of problems. The Burger King where Emma found flies in her pancakes had been operating normally for months. The KFC that served rat meat to the Washington family had been a neighborhood fixture for years. There's no way to predict where the next failure will occur or who will be the next victim. It could be the restaurant you've eaten at hundreds of times without incident. It could be the meal you order tomorrow. It could be you or someone you love sitting in that hospital bed, fighting for their life because they trusted that their food was safe. The fast food industry serves over 50 million Americans every single day. For the vast majority of those transactions, nothing goes wrong. The food is prepared safely, served quickly, and consumed without incident. But statistics are cold comfort to the victims of the failures. Being one in a million is no consolation when you're the one. These stories serve as a reminder that the convenience we take for granted comes with risks we rarely consider. Every time you bite into a burger, you're trusting that dozens of people did their jobs correctly. Every time you order from a drive-thru, you're betting your health on systems that are designed by humans and operated by humans and therefore subject to human error. The victims in these stories were ordinary people making ordinary choices. They weren't taking unnecessary risks or ignoring obvious warning signs. They were simply hungry people who made the same decision millions of others make every day. The fact that their meals became nightmares is a reminder of how thin the line is between safety and catastrophe in our food system. The next time you're about to take a bite of fast food, remember these stories. Remember the trust you're placing in strangers. Remember that the systems designed to protect you aren't perfect. Remember that the consequences of failure can be devastating and permanent. Not to paralyze you with fear, but to remind you that the simple act of eating carries risks we rarely acknowledge. These 4 stories represent different types of failures that can occur in the fast food industry. Contaminated supply chains, deliberate sabotage, neglected sanitation, systemic infestations. Each reveals vulnerabilities in the systems we depend on to keep us safe. Each shows how quickly a routine meal can become a life-threatening situation. The horror isn't just in the individual incidents, but in the knowledge that they'll continue to happen. That as you're watching this video, contaminated food is being prepared somewhere. That employees are making decisions that will harm customers. That supply chains are failing in ways that won't be discovered until people start getting sick. The victims I've told you about tonight will carry the scars of their experiences for the rest of their lives. Physical scars from the injuries they sustained, emotional scars from the trauma they endured, financial scars from the costs they incurred. Their lives were forever changed by meals that should have been safe. Their stories serve as a warning about the hidden dangers in our food system. A reminder that the convenience we enjoy comes with costs we rarely consider. A call to demand better from the industry that feeds us, because until we do, these horrors will continue to occur, and the next victim could be anyone. The fluorescent lights of that fast food restaurant will continue to hum. The smell of grease will continue to fill the air. The tired employees will continue to serve millions of customers every day. And somewhere, in some restaurant, at some time, the next horror story is already beginning to unfold.